The massive viewing ports of the Galactic Academy stretched from floor to ceiling, revealing the breathtaking vista of three moons hanging like silver coins against the star-filled void. Inside the Academy's main corridor, the morning rush was, and like anything found on Earth, students floated past on anti-gravity platforms, their exotic forms creating a living rainbow of galactic diversity. Hannah Kim walked among them, her feet firmly planted on the polished marble floor while others glided effortlessly through the air. Her worn sneakers squeaked against the pristine surface, the sound echoing embarrassingly in the vast space. The faded olive-green military jacket hung loose on her small frame, its patches and worn edges telling stories she didn't even know. By the Seven Sons of Altair, Prince Qianwu's voice cut through the ambient hum of conversation like a plasma blade. His towering 8-foot frame cast a shadow over Hannah as he descended from his floating platform, his blue-scaled skin rippling, with patterns that showed his amusement. What primitive creature has wandered into our sacred halls? His entourage of Altarian nobles landed round him with perfect synchronization, their ceremonial robes shimmering with built-in energy fields that cost more than most humans earned in a lifetime. They formed a semicircle round Hannah, their reptilian eyes gleaming with cruel entertainment. "Look at that pathetic excuse for clothing," sneered Timon, his crystalline Zephyrian form refracting the corridor's light into dancing rainbows. When he spoke, his voice chimed like broken glass. "That jacket looks like it survived a meteor impact. How embarrassing for their entire species." Hannah clutched her datapad tighter against her chest, the device's cracked screen reflecting her wide, frightened eyes. She had worked 3 jobs during her final year of high school to afford the Academy's application fees. Her test scores had been perfect, her essays praised by the admissions committee. But none of that seemed to matter now. "I heard humans don't even have proper environmental suits," laughed another Altarian, his forked tongue flaking out to taste the air. "They have to wear these primitive fabric coverings to survive. How do they even function in space?" The group's laughter echoed off the Academy's crystal walls, drawing stares from other students. Some looked away uncomfortably, while others joined in the mockery. A few of the more exotic species, beings made of living energy or sentient gas, clouds, shifted their forms in what Hannah recognized as alien expressions of disdain. "Please," Hannah whispered, her voice barely audible above the din. "I just want to get to class." "Class." Prince Qianwu's laugh was like the screech of metal on metal. "You think you belong in the same educational facilities as the children of galactic royalty? Your species barely learned to leave their own planet a century ago." The crowd was growing now, drawn by the spectacle. Hannah caught sight of Professor Zeta, her advanced quantum mechanics instructor, watching from across the hall. For a moment, she hoped he might intervene. But the insectoid teacher simply clicked his mandibles and walked away, unwilling to cause a diplomatic incident with the Altarian delegation. "I earned my place here," Hannah said, finding a small spark of courage. "My entrance exam scores were in the top 1% of all applicants' entrance exams." Timon's crystalline form pulsed with amusement. "How quaint. They actually make humans take tests. We assumed you were here as some sort of charity case, like the Academy's exotic pet collection." The bell chimed for a first period, its melodic tones reverberating through the station's superstructure. The crowd began to disperse, but Prince Qianwu wasn't finished with his entertainment. "Wait," he called out, his voice carrying the authority of someone born to rule star systems. "Before we continue with our education, shouldn't we address the hygiene concern? That jacket smells like it's been stored in a cargo hold for decades." Hannah's cheeks burned with shame. The jacket did smell musty. It had been stored in her grandmother's closet for years before being passed down to her, but it was warm, and it reminded her of the grandfather she had never known. Maybe "We should call maintenance," suggested another, alien student, this one resembling a walking tree with golden bark. "They could escort this lost janitor back to the service levels where she belongs." The laughter that followed was like a physical blow. Hannah felt tears welling up in her eyes, but she refused to let them fall. Not here, not in front of them. By the time lunch period arrived, word had spread throughout the academy. The human girl in the ridiculous jacket had become the day's main source of entertainment. Students made exaggerated shows of covering their breathing apparatus when she passed, whispered loudly about primitive Earth customs, and some even took holographic recordings to share with friends on their home worlds. In the vast cafeteria, with its floating tables and gravity-defying architecture, Hannah sat alone at a corner table on the lower level, the only section with traditional seating for a species that hadn't evolved past needing solid surfaces. That's when Prince Qianwu decided to make his grand announcement. The transport bays. Energy field shimmered like liquid starlight as the military vessel's sleek black hull materialized through the dimensional gateway. Steam hissed from the landing struts as they touched down on the Academy's reinforced deck plates, and the massive doors sealed shut with a thunderous clang that echoed throughout the station. Inside the ship's cramped cockpit, warning lights bathed everything in red as the pilot's voice crackled through the intercom. "General Park, we've arrived at the Galactic Academy. Station security has cleared us for immediate disembarkation." The transport bay fell silent except for the hum of the ship's cooling systems. Then, with a pneumatic hiss, the boarding ramp descended, revealing a figure that made even the station's automated defense systems pause in recognition. General Woojin Park stepped into the artificial light of the Academy, his combat boots striking the deck with the measured precision of a man who had walked across 1,000 battlefields. His Terran Defense Force uniform was pressed to perfection, its midnight black fabric seeming to absorb light rather than reflect it. But it was the ribbons across his chest that told the real story, rows upon rows of commendations, each one representing a battle won, a world saved, or a last stand that had turned the tide of war. The most prominent was the Stellar Cross, its golden surface catching the overhead lights. Only 12 humans in history had ever received one, and 3 of them were dead. Below it hung the Void War Campaign Medal, its dark purple ribbon representing the 3-year conflict that had nearly ended human civilization. His face bore the marks of those wars. A thin scar ran from his left temple to his jaw, a gift from Krillian plasma fire during the siege of New Seoul. His eyes, dark and calculating, seemed to see everything at once: the positioning of the security cameras, the structural weak points in the station's architecture, the exact number of steps to every exit. "Sir, the Academy's protocol droid approached with mechanical precision, its chrome surface reflecting the General's image in fractured pieces. Director Vexillarian has been notified of your arrival. Shall I escort you to the administrative section?" "No." General Park's voice carried the quiet authority of someone who had commanded fleets in the deep void of space. "I'll conduct my own reconnaissance." The Academy's warning klaxons suddenly blared to life, their wailing cry echoing through every corridor and chamber of the massive station. Red lights flashed in sequence along the walls as the intercom crackled to life with barely contained panic. "Attention all students and faculty," came the voice of Director Vexillarian, the Academy's Altarian Administrator. "General Woojin Park of the Terran Defense Force has arrived for an unscheduled inspection of our military preparedness program. All students must report to their assigned emergency stations immediately. This is not a drill." The effect was immediate and electric throughout the Academy's sprawling complex. Alien students who had been lounging in anti-gravity lounges or floating through the corridors in casual conversation suddenly snapped to attend. The name General Park carried weight throughout the galaxy. He was the human who had held the line at the Battle of Proxima Gate, the tactician who had outmaneuvered the Krillian war fleets, the soldier who had single-handedly changed the course of galactic history. Prince Kyunwoo, who had been regaling his friends with holographic recordings of his earlier humiliation of the human girl, merely choked on his nutrient cube when the announcement echoed through the cafeteria. His blue-scaled skin went pale as he remembered the stories his own military instructors had told him about the legendary human general by the Seven Suns. He whispered, his voice trembling, "The Void Walker himself is here." That was the name the alien militaries had given General Park during the war. The Void Walker, the human who seemed to move through space itself like a ghost, appearing where he was least expected and striking with devastating precision. General Park stepped out of the transport bay and into the Academy's main thoroughfare, his presence causing a ripple effect throughout the station. Students who had been floating casually through the corridors suddenly found their feet. Alien nobles who had never shown respect to any human before now stood at attention. And even the Academy's automated systems seemed to hum with increased efficiency. He moved through the halls like a predator studying its territory, his trained eyes cataloging every detail. The defensive positions were adequate but not optimal. The emergency evacuation routes had obvious bottlenecks. The students showed promise but lacked the discipline that came from real combat experience. As he walked, his enhanced tactical display, an neural implant that had saved his life countless times, highlighted potential threats and strategic positions. The Academy was well defended against conventional attack, but vulnerable to infiltration from the lower service levels. He filed that information away for his report. The General's route through the Academy was not random. His decades of experience had taught him that the true measure of any institution was found not in its grand halls or ceremonial chambers, but in its forgotten corners and quiet spaces. It was there that you found the real story. The students who struggled, the faculty who truly cared, the moments of genuine character that revealed everything. Turning a corner near the Academy's old library section, he stopped abruptly. His enhanced hearing had picked up something that made his blood run cold. The sound of quiet sobbing echoing from an alcove ahead. It was a sound he had heard too many times before. In refugee camps and on battlefields, in the aftermath of victories that had cost too much. There, sitting alone in a small alcove between two ancient bookshelves, was a young girl in a faded olive-green jacket. She had her knees drawn up to her chest, her face buried in her arms, and her shoulders shaking. With silent tears, the jacket was old, its fabric worn thin in places. But General Park's trained eye immediately recognized something that made his heart stop. The cut was military issue. The stitching pattern was regulation. The way the fabric had worn at the elbows and shoulders spoke of real combat, real battles, real sacrifice. This wasn't some civilian knockoff or fashion statement. This was a genuine military field jacket. One that had seen action in places where bullets flew and heroes fell. His enhanced vision zoomed in on the patches, and what he saw made his breath catch in his throat. There, on the left shoulder, was a unit insignia that officially didn't exist, worn by soldiers who had never been acknowledged, representing a sacrifice that had never been publicly recognized. General Park's footsteps echoed in the empty hallway. As he approached, each step measured and deliberate. This was no longer a routine inspection. This was something far more personal, far more important than any military assessment. The girl looked up at the sound of his approach, her tear-stained face reflecting a mixture of fear and resignation. She probably expected more mockery, more humiliation, another authority figure telling her she didn't belong. Instead, she found herself looking into the eyes of a man who had seen the very best and worst of what the galaxy had to offer, and who recognized something precious when he saw it. The general's voice cut through the silence like a blade, but it carried none of the harshness Hannah had come to expect from authority figures. There was something different about this man. The way he held himself, the way his eyes seemed to see straight through to her soul. The way even the station's background hum seemed to quiet in his presence. "Excuse me." "Cadet," he said softly, the word cadet carrying a weight and respect that no one had ever shown her before. Hannah's head snapped up, her tear-stained face reflecting the corridor's pale lighting. She had been discovered in her moment of weakness, caught hiding like a wounded animal. Her first instinct was to run, but something about the general's presence rooted her to the spot. She scrambled to her feet, her worn sneakers squeaking against the polished floor. "Sir, I'm sorry. I was just—" she began, her voice trembling with a mixture of fear and embarrassment. She expected another lecture about how she didn't belong. Another reminder of her place in the Academy's social hierarchy. "The jacket," General Park interrupted. But his interruption was gentle, almost reverent. His dark eyes were fixed on her left shoulder with an intensity that made her skin prickle. "May I see the patch?" Hannah's confusion deepened. In all the mocking and humiliation she had endured that day, no one had paid attention to the specific details of her grandfather's old jacket. They had only seen something worn and shabby, something that marked her as different, as lesser. But this man, this legendary figure whose name was spoken with throughout the galaxy, was looking at her jacket like he was seeing a ghost. With trembling hands, she turned slightly, revealing the patch that had rested against her shoulder all day. It was about the size of her palm, embroidered with threads that had once been bright but were now faded with age. The image showed a snarling wolf's head, its eyes seeming to glow even in the dim light, surrounded by a circle of stars that represented something she had never understood. Below the wolf, in characters that she recognized as Korean but couldn't read, were the words, "Honor through sacrifice." Her grandmother had taught her to pronounce them when she was young, but had never explained what they meant. General Park's breath caught in his throat as if he had been struck by a physical blow. His enhanced vision systems automatically zoomed in on the patch, analyzing every thread, every stitch, every minute detail. The craftsmanship was military-grade. The materials were authentic, and the wear patterns were consistent with years of actual combat use. The 7th Terran Rangers, the Ghost Wolves, a unit that existed only in the most classified military databases, whose missions had been so secret that even their existence was denied by 3 different galactic governments. They had been humanity's shadow warriors, the soldiers who went where no one else could go, who did what no one else could do, and who died in places whose names would never be spoken aloud. "Where did you get this jacket?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. The question carried the weight of 15 years of buried memories, of friends lost in the darkness between stars, of sacrifices that had saved billions of lives but would never be acknowledged. It belonged to my grandfather," Hannah replied, her confusion evident in every word. She had never seen an adult react to the jacket this way. Most people barely noticed it, and those who did usually dismissed it as some sort of vintage military surplus. "His name was Sergeant Jin Ho Kim. He died when I was very young. My grandmother said he was a soldier, but she never talked about what he did." The name hit General Park like a plasma bolt to the chest. Jin Ho Kim, the man who had saved his life on Kepler to be. The soldier who had carried him 3 kilometers through enemy territory when shrapnel had torn through his leg. The friend who had shared his last ration pack during the siege of Outpost Delta. The brother-in-arms who had made the ultimate sacrifice that others could live. General Park's hands shook as he reached inside his uniform jacket, his fingers finding the small, worn photograph he had carried with him for over a decade. The edges were frayed from handling, the colors faded from age, but the image was still clear enough to break his heart every time he looked at it. It had been taken during a brief respite on the space station orbiting Kepler-440b, just 3 days before the mission that would claim the lives of every member of the 7th Rangers except for him. In the photo, a younger version of himself stood next to a stocky Korean man with kind eyes and a fierce smile that could light up the darkest corners of space. Both men wore the same midnight black uniform, the same unit patch, the same expression of brotherhood that only came from facing death together and emerging victorious. Jinho had his arm round the younger general's shoulders, and they were both laughing at something off camera. Probably one of Jinho's terrible jokes that somehow managed to be funny in the most desperate situations. Jinho Kim, General Park, said, his voice thick with emotion as he held out the photograph with trembling fingers. "Your grandfather. He was my best friend." Hannah stared at the photograph, her mind struggling to process what she was seeing. The man in the picture looked exactly like the grandfather she remembered from her grandmother's stories. The same warm smile, the same gentle eyes, the same strong shoulders that had carried her on piggyback rides during his brief visits home. But there was something else in the photo that took her breath away. The man standing next to her grandfather was unmistakably a younger version of General Park, his face unmarked by the scars of war, his eyes bright with the confidence of youth. They looked like brothers, like men who had faced the impossible together and emerged stronger for it. "You knew him?" she whispered, her voice barely audible. "You actually knew my grandfather?" General Park nodded, unable to trust his voice. The memories were flooding back now. Jinho's terrible singing voice during the long watches, his uncanny ability to find food in the most desolate places, his unwavering loyalty to his squad and his unshakable faith in humanity's cause. "He saved my life," the general finally managed to say, his words carrying the weight of absolute truth, more than once. "He was the finest soldier I ever had the honor to serve with, and the best friend I ever had the privilege to know." The corridor around them seemed to fade away as the past and present collided. Here, in this forgotten corner of an alien academy, a legend was discovering that the memory of his fallen friend lived on in the most unexpected way, in the trembling hands of a young girl who wore her grandfather's sacrifice like a shield against the cruelty of the world. The Academy's main auditorium was a marvel of alien engineering, its crystalline dome stretching 500 meters across and rising into the star-filled void above. Holographic displays floated in the air, showing real-time feeds from across the galaxy. While the seating arrangement defied traditional physics, some students sat in gravity-controlled pods that floated at different levels, while others clung to the walls with specialized appendages. Within an hour of General Park's discovery, every living being in the Academy had been summoned to this vast chamber. The emergency assembly protocols, rarely used except for the most dire circumstances, had activated automatically when the general's biometric signature registered what the station's AI classified as extreme emotional distress. Director Vexilarian, the Academy's Aetant Altarian administrator, stood at the side of the stage wringing his hands nervously. He had tried to dissuade the general from this impromptu assembly, citing diplomatic protocols and the delicate nature of interspecies relations, but one look at the human's face had silenced all objections. General Park stood at the central podium, his imposing figure dwarfed by the auditorium's massive scale but somehow commanding the attention of every being present. The photograph of him and Jinho Kim was still clutched in his hand, its edges worn smooth by his trembling fingers. In the front row, Hannah sat motionless, her grandfather's jacket feeling heavier with each passing moment. The alien students round her, beings she had never been permitted to sit near, kept stealing glances at her, their expressions ranging from curiosity to something that might have been the beginning of respect. Prince Kyunwoo occupied his usual position in the elevated noble section, his blue-scaled skin having lost much of its earlier shimmer. The holographic recordings he had made of Hannah's humiliation were still stored in his personal device, but now they felt like evidence of a crime rather than entertainment. 15 years ago, General Park began, his voice carrying clearly through the auditorium's advanced acoustic systems. Humanity faced its darkest hour. The casual conversations that had been rippling through the crowd died instantly when the Void Walker spoke. The galaxy listened. The Krillian Empire had broken through our outer defenses in the Kepler system. He continued, his words painting a picture of desperate warfare among the stars. Their bioships were unlike anything we had faced before, living vessels that could adapt to our weapons, heal from our attacks, and reproduce in the vacuum of space faster than we could destroy them. Holographic displays materialized round the auditorium, showing archived footage of the Krillian war fleet. The alien vessels looked like massive insects crossed with warships, their chitinous hulls gleaming with organic technology that pulsed with malevolent life. Even 15 years later, the sight of them made several students unconsciously move closer together. They were advancing on the civilian evacuation routes. General Park's voice grew heavy with the weight of memory. 2 million innocent souls, men, women, and children from a dozen worlds, were fleeing for their lives in every ship that could carry them. Cargo haulers, passenger liners, even mining vessels pressed into service as refugee transports. The holographic display shifted to show the desperate evacuation, massive ships overloaded with family. Children pressed against viewports as they fled their dying worlds, the organized chaos of a civilization trying to survive its own extinction. The evacuation fleet was defenseless. The general continued, they had no weapons, no shields, no way to fight back. They only had speed, and even that was failing them. The Krillian bioships were faster, more maneuverable, and closing in for the kill. As Ephraim's student in the upper tiers whispered something to his companion, but the sound carried in the perfect acoustics of the chamber. General Park's eyes found him instantly. "You find this amusing?" the general asked, his voice carrying a dangerous edge. "The extinction of 2 million beings strikes you as entertaining?" The student's crystalline form flickered with embarrassment. "No, sir. I apologize, sir. The only thing standing between those refugees and certain death," General Park resumed, his gaze sweeping across the assembled students, "was a single company of Terran Rangers, the 7th Rangers, 200 soldiers against 50,000 enemy troops." The numbers hit the auditorium like a physical blow. Even the most privileged alien nobles understood basic mathematics. The odds were not just impossible, they were suicidal. They were told to hold the line for 6 hours. The general's voice dropped to barely above a whisper, forcing everyone to strain to hear. 6 hours to buy time for the evacuation ships to reach the hyperspace jump point. 6 hours to save 2 million lives. Prince Kyunwoo, who had been lounging in his seat with typical Altarian arrogance, slowly straightened as the magnitude of the story became clear. His people were warriors, bred for a battle across 1,000 generations. But even they understood the concept of a hopeless last stand. They held it for 72 hours, General Park announced, his voice suddenly thundering through the chamber. 72 hours of continuous combat against overwhelming odds. 72 hours of heroes refusing to yield. The holographic displays showed tactical maps of the battle, A tiny cluster of human positions surrounded by wave after wave of Krillian attackers. The defensive perimeter shrank with each passing hour. But it never broke. Sergeant Jin Ho Kim, the general, continued, his eyes finding Hannah in the crowd. Personally destroyed for a Krillian war mechs with nothing but improvised explosives and the kind of courage that defines our species. The displays shifted to show the massive alien war machines, 60-meter-tall biomechanical nightmares that walked on legs like twisted trees. Their multiple arms ending in weapons that could level city blocks. The idea that a single human soldier could bring down even one of them seemed impossible. When his position was overrun, General Park's voice broke slightly. When the defensive line finally crumbled after 3 days of hell, Jin Ho Kim made a choice that saved countless lives. He stayed behind to detonate the charges that brought down the mountain pass, sealing the route and buying the evacuation fleet the final minutes they needed to escape. Hannah's hands flew to her mouth as the reality of her grandfather's sacrifice hit her. She had always known he was a soldier, had always known he died in service, but she had never understood the true scope of his heroism. Every one of those rangers died on that nameless world, the general said, his voice carrying the weight of 15 years of survivor's guilt. They died so that others could live. They died so that children could grow up free. They died because that's what humans do. We stand between the darkness and the light. No matter the cost. The auditorium was now completely silent, every being hanging on his words. Even the station's automated systems seemed to hum more quietly, as if the very machinery recognized the sacredness of the moment. This jacket, General Park gestured toward Hannah, this faded one, embarrassing piece of cloth, was worn by a man who saved 2 million lives. It has been baptized in the fire of sacrifice, consecrated by the blood of heroes, and hallowed by the tears of those who lived because of what he did. The weight of his words settled over the auditorium like a shroud. In the space of an hour, everything had changed. The girl they had mocked was revealed as the inheritor of a legend. The jacket they had ridiculed was shown to be a sacred relic, and the assumptions they had made about human weakness were shattered like glass against the rocks of truth. The silence in the auditorium was so complete that the hum of the station's life support systems seemed to roar like thunder. General Park's words had stripped away 15 years of carefully buried emotion. Now the raw truth of what had happened in the Kepler system hung in the air like a living thing. Your grandfather was posthumously awarded the Terran Cross, General Park said, turning to face Hannah directly. His voice carried the weight of 15 years of grief and pride, of sleepless nights haunted by the faces of fallen friends, of a survivor's guilt that no amount of medals or recognition could ever heal. The highest honor our species can bestow. But more than that, he was awarded something far more precious, the eternal gratitude of every soul who draws breath because of his sacrifice. The Terran Cross, even the alien students knew what that meant. Only 12 humans in the galaxy's recorded history had ever received it, and most of them had died earning it. It was more than a medal. It was a declaration that this person had transcended the normal boundaries of courage and entered the realm of legend. Hannah stood frozen in her seat, tears streaming down her face as the magnitude of her grandfather's sacrifice finally became clear. She had always known he was a soldier, had always known he died serving his people, but she had never understood that he was one of the greatest heroes in human history. The jacket she wore wasn't just clothing. It was a memorial to a man who had literally saved millions of lives. General Park stepped down from the podium, his combat boots echoing in the vast chamber as he approached the front row. Every eye in the auditorium followed his movement, every being present understanding that they were witnessing something unprecedented in all his years of service. The legendary Void Walker had never publicly honored a fallen comrade in such a dramatic fashion. When he reached Hannah, who had risen to her feet with shaking legs, he came to perfect attention. His spine straightened, his shoulders squared, and his hand snapped to his forehead in the crispest military salute ever rendered in the Academy's history. But this wasn't just any salute. This was a general saluting a sergeant's granddaughter, a living legend paying tribute to a fallen hero. "Ladies and gentlemen," he announced, his voice carrying to every corner of the vast chamber, "you are in the presence of the granddaughter of a hero. This jacket, which some of you mocked, is a sacred relic. It was worn by a man who embodied the very best of what it means to be human." The words hit Prince Kyunwoo like a physical blow. He had been raised in the warrior culture of Voltaire, where honor was everything and dishonor was worse than death. In the span of an hour, he had gone from being a privileged noble to being a bully who had mocked the memory of a galactic hero. The shame burned in his chest like molten metal. Slowly, as if moving through thick atmosphere, Prince Kyunwoo rose from his seat. His blue-scaled skin had lost all its shimmer, and his reptilian eyes were wide with a mixture of horror and regret. The other Altarian students watched in amazement as their prince, their arrogant and touchable prince, began the long walk down to the auditorium floor. His footsteps echoed in the silence, each step a hammer blow against his own pride. He had been raised to believe that Altarians were superior to all other species, that their ancient warrior culture made them the natural leaders of the galaxy. But now he understood that true warriors weren't born. They were forged in the fires of sacrifice. And the greatest warrior he had ever encountered was a dead human sergeant whose granddaughter he had spent the morning tormenting. When he reached the front of the auditorium, Prince Kyunwoo did something that shocked every Altarian present. He dropped to one knee before Hannah, his proud head bowed in genuine contrition. In his culture, kneeling was reserved for acknowledging a superior warrior, and he had never knelt to anyone except his own grandfather, the Emperor of Voltaire. I'm deeply sorry," he said, his voice breaking with emotion. "I have dishonored myself and my people with my ignorance and cruelty. Please forgive me." The apology sent shockwaves through the alien community. Prince Kyunwoo was known throughout the Academy for his arrogance, his casual cruelty, his assumption that his royal blood made him superior to everyone round him. To see him kneeling before the human girl he had mocked was like watching a mountain bow to a flower. But his action had broken the dam of shame that had been building in every student who had participated in Hannah's humiliation. One by one, they began to rise from their seats, first the other Altarians, then the Zephyrians, then the floating energy beings and the crystalline entities and the insectoid scholars. Even the faculty members, who had stood by and watched the morning's cruelty without intervening, rose to their feet. The wave of respect spread through the auditorium like wildfire. Students who had never shown courtesy to a human before stood at attention. Beings who had considered themselves superior to the primitive species from Earth now understood that they had been in the presence of greatness and had failed to recognize it. Timon, the Zephyrian noble who had laughed at Hannah's jacket, stepped forward with his crystalline form pulsing with shame. "I beg your forgiveness," he said, his voice chiming like broken glass. "I have learned today that true nobility has nothing to do with birth or wealth. It comes from courage and sacrifice. And your grandfather possessed both in abundance." Professor Zeta, the insectoid instructor who had walked away rather than defend Hannah, clicked his mandibles in the Thraxian gesture of deep respect. "I failed in my duty as an educator," he said. "I should have seen the honor you carry and protected it. Instead, I allowed ignorance to flourish in my presence. I am ashamed." General Park watched the transformation with a mixture of satisfaction and sorrow. This was what Jinho would have wanted. Not revenge, but understanding. not punishment. But education. His friend had always believed that the galaxy's species could learn to live together in peace, and perhaps today's lesson would be a small step in that direction. From this day forward, General Park announced, his voice carrying across the still silent auditorium. The Jinho Kim Memorial Scholarship will be established, ensuring that the children of our heroes never want for anything. But more importantly, he turned to Hannah, placing a gentle hand on her shoulder. You will carry your grandfather's legacy forward, not just in that jacket, but in your heart. As the assembly began to disperse, students and faculty members approached. Hannah one by one. Some offered formal apologies, others simply bowed in respect, and a few of the younger students asked shyly if they could hear more stories about her grandfather. The girl who had sat alone at lunch was now surrounded by beings who wanted to learn from her, to understand her, to honor the memory she carried. Hannah remained standing at the front of the auditorium long after the crowds had thinned. No longer the frightened girl who had been mocked that morning. She was Jinho Kim's granddaughter, keeper of his memory, bearer of his legacy, and a reminder that sometimes the greatest heroes wear the most humble clothes. The faded jacket no longer seemed worn. It seemed weathered, like a battle standard that had seen glory and emerged victorious. And as the artificial stars wheeled overhead in the Academy's dome, Hannah understood that she would never again walk alone through these halls. She carried with her the love of a grandfather she had barely known, the respect of beings she had never expected to understand her, and the knowledge that heroism was not about the clothes you wore, but about the courage you carried in your heart. The end.